At my son's wedding, he thanked his real father in front of 200 guests. And after I spent $70,000 of my life savings, my heart shattered with sadness and disappointment as I walked away. But what happened next taught him the most expensive lesson about respect he'll ever learn. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. That night, I stood in my best suit, proud but exhausted, watching the reception unfold. When my son took the microphone, my heart swelled. I expected gratitude. I expected acknowledgement of everything I had given up for him. But what I did next would shock everyone and teach my son a lesson about gratitude he would never forget. Instead, he thanked everyone, his bride, his mother, who had walked out on him when he was 3, and then with a smile he thanked his real father, the stepfather, who had only been in his life for 5 years. The room erupted in applause while my world collapsed. 22 years of sacrifice, of being both mother and father, vanished in a single sentence. The pain was so sharp I could feel something inside me break, something I knew would never heal the same way again. I looked around at the cheering guests, completely unaware that they had just witnessed the destruction of a father's heart. The walls seemed to close in as the truth hit me. My son, the child I had raised and loved, had publicly disowned me. He had erased me in front of everyone. But here's what nobody in that room knew, what Marcus himself didn't realize when he spoke those words. That moment would set off a chain of events that changed everything. When someone shows you who they truly are, sometimes the only thing left to do is believe them. And sometimes the quiet man who raised you with nothing but love has far more power than anyone imagined. Let me take you back to where this all began, because to understand the depth of this betrayal, you need to know what those 22 years really cost me. When Sarah walked out on us, Marcus was just 3 years old. I remember that day like it was yesterday. Not because it was dramatic or explosive, but because of how quietly it happened. I came home from work to find a note on the kitchen table and half the closet empty. "I can't do this anymore," it said. "I need to find myself. Take care of Marcus." Just like that, she was gone, leaving me with a confused toddler who kept asking when Mommy was coming home. I was 25 years old, working as a junior accountant at a small firm, barely making enough to cover our modest apartment rent. Suddenly, I wasn't just responsible for providing financially, I was everything. Mother, father, teacher, disciplinarian, comforter, protector. Those first few months were the hardest of my life. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning to get Marcus ready for daycare, work a full day, pick him up, come home to cook dinner, help with whatever learning activities a 3-year-old could handle, give him a bath, read him stories, and finally collapse into bed, only to do it all over again. Weekends weren't for rest. They were for grocery shopping with a toddler in tow, doing laundry while entertaining a small child, and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in our tiny 2-bedroom apartment. I watched other men my age going out with friends, dating, building their careers without the weight of single parenthood, and I won't lie, there were moments I felt resentful. But then Marcus would climb into my lap with a book, or wrap his tiny arms around my neck and tell me he loved me, and every sacrifice felt worth it. I took on extra freelance work in the evenings, after he went to bed, building spreadsheets and doing bookkeeping for small businesses just to afford better daycare, better food, better everything for him. My social life became non-existent. Dating was nearly impossible. I turned down promotions that would require travel because I couldn't bear the thought of being away from him overnight. The learning curve of single fatherhood was steep and unforgiving, filled with moments that would have been comical if they hadn't been so desperately important to get right. I still remember the first time Marcus got sick with a high fever when he was 4 years old. It was 2 in the morning, and his temperature spiked to 104 degrees. I had no idea what to do. Should I rush him to the emergency room? Give him medicine? Call someone? But who? Sarah's family had cut contact after she left, and my own parents lived 3 states away. So there I was, this terrified father Googling pediatric fever symptoms on my ancient laptop while my son burned up in my arms. I ended up spending the night in the hospital emergency room, holding him while he slept fitfully. Learning that sometimes being a parent means making decisions with incomplete information and praying you're doing the right thing. Then there were the everyday challenges that no one prepares single fathers for. Learning to braid hair was a particularly humbling experience. Marcus went through a phase where he wanted his hair braided like some of the girls in his class, and I spent hours watching YouTube videos trying to master the technique. My first attempts were disasters, uneven, too tight, falling apart by lunchtime. But I kept practicing, because seeing his proud smile when he looked in the mirror made every failed attempt worth it. I became an expert in things I never thought I'd need to know. The difference between good and bad children's TV shows, how to remove chocolate milk stains from white shirts, the art of negotiating with a 6-year-old about bedtime, and the precise amount of patience required to help with math homework without losing your mind. Parent-teacher conferences became my specialty. I knew every teacher, every concern, every triumph. I was the father who showed up to every school event, even when it meant leaving work early or rearranging client meetings. Soccer games, school plays, science fairs, field trip chaperoning, I was there for all of it, often the only single parent in a sea of couples. Other parents would comment on how dedicated I was, how Marcus was lucky to have such an involved father, never realizing that I wasn't just involved, I was everything he had. As Marcus grew from a confused toddler into a bright, curious child, we developed something special, a bond that I thought was unbreakable. We weren't just father and son. We were a team, partners in this life we'd built together. Our camping trips became legendary, at least in our small world. Every summer, I'd pack our beat-up Honda Civic with a borrowed tent, sleeping bags, and enough snacks to feed a small army, and we'd head to whatever state park offered the cheapest camping rates. Marcus would spend weeks beforehand planning our adventures, researching hiking trails that were appropriate for his age, marking fishing spots on maps he'd print out from the library computer. These trips weren't elaborate or expensive. We cooked hot dogs over campfires and told stories under stars we could actually see away from the city lights. But they were ours, and the joy on his face when he caught his first fish or successfully started a campfire made every mosquito bite and uncomfortable night on the ground worth it. Teaching him to drive was another milestone that I'll never forget. He was 15 and a half, counting down the days until he could get his learner's permit, and I was probably more nervous than he was. We started in empty parking lots on Sunday mornings, my hands gripping the passenger seat as he jerked the car forward and backward, learning the feel of the clutch in my old manual transmission car. "Dad, I got it," he'd say with teenage confidence, right before stalling at a green light. But gradually, he did get it, and the pride in his eyes when he parallel parked perfectly for his driving test was matched only by the pride I felt watching him achieve this milestone. Homework sessions were our nightly ritual from elementary school through high school. The kitchen table became command central, covered with textbooks, notebooks, and my increasingly complex attempts to help with subjects that had changed significantly since my own school days. Math evolved into concepts I barely remembered. Science projects required supplies that strained our budget. And don't get me started on the new ways they teach English grammar. But we figured it out together, night after night, sometimes until midnight, when a particularly challenging assignment demanded extra effort. When Marcus turned 18 and graduated high school, I thought we'd made it. I thought the hardest part was over. He'd been accepted to a good state university with a partial scholarship, and I was already working extra hours to cover the remaining costs. We were planning his dorm room, discussing class schedules, and I was secretly proud that we'd navigated single parenthood so successfully. That's when Sarah decided to reappear in our lives, like a storm cloud on an otherwise perfect day. She showed up at his graduation ceremony uninvited, accompanied by a man I'd never seen before, tall, silver-haired, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. Robert, as I'd soon learn, was everything I wasn't. Wealthy, connected, polished. He owned a successful consulting firm, lived in a gated community, and drove cars that cost more than I'd ever spent on anything in my life. Sarah looked different too. Designer clothes, professional makeup, the kind of confidence that comes from financial security. She approached us after the ceremony with tears in her eyes and apologies on her lips. "I know I made mistakes," she said, "but I've gotten my life together now. I'm ready to be a mother again." Ready to be a mother again. As if motherhood was a hobby she'd put on hold and could pick up whenever convenient. I watched Marcus's face during this reunion, seeing confusion, curiosity, and something that made my stomach drop. Hope. Hope that maybe, finally, he'd have the complete family he'd always wondered about. Robert was smooth, I'll give him that. He knew exactly what to say to an 18-year-old who'd grown up without his mother. "Your father did an incredible job raising you," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that was just a little too firm. "But every young man needs mentorship as he enters the adult world. I'd love to help with that, if you're open to it." Marcus was more than open to it. Within weeks, he was spending weekends at their house. A sprawling suburban mansion with a pool, a 3-car garage, and more space than our apartment had ever provided. Sarah would call him daily, making up for lost time with expensive gifts and elaborate plans. Robert offered internship opportunities, networking connections, and insights into a world of success that I could never provide. I watched my son being seduced by the life he'd always deserved, but I'd never been able to give him. The change in Marcus was gradual at first, so subtle that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. It started with small things: canceled dinners because he had plans with Sarah and Robert, less enthusiasm for our traditional camping trips because he'd discovered luxury resorts, and a new vocabulary that included words like networking and opportunity. He'd always been grateful for what we had, understanding that money was tight and appreciating the sacrifices I made. Suddenly, he seemed embarrassed by our modest lifestyle, critical of things that had never bothered him before. "Dad, why don't you ever travel?" he asked one evening, after returning from a weekend trip to Napa Valley with Sarah and Robert. "There's so much world to see, and you just stay here working all the time. How do you explain to your son that travel costs money you don't have when you've spent 18 years putting his needs before your own desires? How do you tell him that staying here working all the time was exactly what enabled him to take trips to Napa Valley with his mother and her wealthy husband?" The criticism stung, but what hurt more was the growing distance. Marcus started calling Sarah Mom again, something he hadn't done since she left. He'd mention Robert's advice about career choices, Robert's insights about business, Robert's connections that could help him get ahead. Meanwhile, the man who'd raised him, who'd sacrificed everything for his success, became simply Dad, a title that felt increasingly hollow as it carried less and less weight in his decision-making. College conversations shifted from practical discussions about course loads and study habits to grand plans about internships at Robert's firm and networking events Sarah could arrange. "Robert says I should consider business school after undergrad," Marcus announced one day, as if this decision didn't involve years of additional tuition costs that would fall on my shoulders. When I gently mentioned the financial implications, he looked at me like I was being small-minded. "Dad, you have to think bigger. Robert says investment in education always pays off. Robert says, Robert says, Robert says." It became a constant refrain, and each repetition felt like another nail in the coffin of the relationship I'd spent 18 years building. I was becoming irrelevant in my own son's life, a relic from the struggling years that he was eager to put behind him. 2 years into college, Marcus came home with news that should have filled me with joy, but instead filled me with dread. He was engaged to Rebecca, a lovely girl from a good family who seemed to genuinely care for him. She was studying pre-law, came from a stable 2-parent household, and had the kind of quiet intelligence that reminded me of Marcus at his best. Under different circumstances, I would have been thrilled to welcome her into our small family. But as Marcus excitedly shared their wedding plans, my heart sank. The venue they'd chosen was a historic mansion that charged more per day than I made in 3 months. The guest list included 200 people, most of whom I'd never met. The photographer they wanted was award-winning and priced accordingly. Every detail they described was beautiful, elegant, and completely beyond my financial means. "Don't worry, Dad," Marcus said, seeing the expression on my face. "We'll keep it reasonable. We just want one perfect day, you know. We've been talking to Robert about it, and he has some great ideas for keeping costs manageable while still making it special." Robert again. Even my son's wedding was being influenced by a man who'd known him for less than 2 years. But then Marcus said something that stopped my spiraling thoughts. "I want you to pay for it, Dad. I know it's a lot to ask, but this is important to me. You're my father, and I want you to give me this gift." Despite everything, the growing distance, the constant Robert references, the way he'd been seduced by a lifestyle I couldn't provide, he still wanted me to be the one to pay for his wedding. Maybe this was my chance to reclaim my place in his life, to show him that despite our modest means, his happiness was still my top priority. Maybe financing his dream wedding would remind him of who had always been there, who had always sacrificed for his benefit. I looked at my savings account balance, ran mental calculations of what I could liquidate, considered the possibility of a second mortgage on my small house. $70,000 would wipe out everything I'd managed to save, destroy my retirement plans, and put me in debt for years to come. But as I looked at my son's hopeful face, as I imagined him walking down the aisle and starting his adult life with this milestone properly celebrated, I knew I would find a way. "Of course," I told him. "Whatever you need for your wedding, we'll make it happen." The relief and joy on his face made every financial worry seem worth it. I was still his father, still the one he turned to for the important things, still the one whose approval and support mattered most. What followed were 6 months of financial hemorrhaging disguised as wedding planning. Every vendor Marcus and Rebecca consulted seemed to specialize in the word premium. The florist didn't just arrange flowers. She created botanical experiences. The caterer didn't serve food. He crafted culinary journeys. The band didn't play music. They provided sonic storytelling. And every single one of these elevated experiences came with a price tag that made my head spin. I found myself taking on every freelance project I could find, working 18-hour days to generate the cash flow needed for deposits and payments. My small house became a fortress of invoice folders, vendor contracts, and payment schedules. I sold my car and bought a 15-year-old replacement to free up cash. I canceled my cable subscription, downgraded my phone plan, and started buying generic groceries to squeeze every possible dollar from my budget. Meanwhile, Marcus and Rebecca were having the time of their lives planning their dream celebration. They'd meet with vendors, make selections based purely on preference rather than price, and cheerfully inform me of their decisions. "Dad, we decided to upgrade the linens," Rebecca would say sweetly. "It's only an extra $800, and it really makes such a difference in the photos." Only $800, as if $800 was pocket change rather than 2 weeks of groceries or a month of utilities. The venue required a payment schedule that seemed designed to maximize my stress. 25% due at booking, another 25% 90 days before the event, 30% 60 days before, and the final 20% on the day itself. Each deadline approached like a financial avalanche, requiring me to juggle credit cards, liquidate investments I'd planned to keep for retirement, and perform accounting miracles to make the numbers work. The photographer alone cost more than I'd spent on Marcus's entire high school education. But when I saw the portfolio, I understood why Marcus and Rebecca had chosen her. Her work was truly artistic, the kind of wedding photography that would give them beautiful memories for the rest of their lives. How could I tell them they couldn't have it? The catering was another major expense that kept escalating. What started as a simple, elegant dinner evolved into a 5-course culinary experience with wine pairings, specialty cocktails, and dietary accommodations that required separate menus. When I gently suggested we might consider less expensive options, Marcus looked hurt. "Dad, this is our wedding. It's not like we're going to do this again." As the wedding expenses mounted and my bank account dwindled, I began to notice something troubling. While I was financing this elaborate celebration, I was increasingly being treated like a minor player in the planning process. Vendor meetings were scheduled around Robert's availability, not mine. And when decisions needed to be made, Marcus would say, "Let me check with Robert and get back to you." My opinions about everything from the ceremony music to the reception timeline were politely noted and then ignored in favor of Robert's preferences. Sarah had seamlessly inserted herself into the role of mother of the groom, making decisions about flowers, decorations, and wedding party coordination as if she'd been present for Marcus's entire life instead of just the last 2 years, even calling vendors directly and claiming to speak on behalf of the family while I learned about these conversations secondhand. The most painful part was watching Marcus defer to them in matters where I had infinitely more experience and wisdom. When they suggested expensive wedding favors that would blow the budget, I pointed out that guests rarely keep these items and suggested a more meaningful but affordable alternative, only for Marcus to dismiss it immediately with, "Robert thinks the favors make a statement about the kind of celebration we're having," as if Robert's opinion carried more weight than the practical financial wisdom of the man paying for everything. Wedding dress shopping was another exclusion that cut deep. Sarah organized a girls' day for Rebecca and her bridesmaids, complete with champagne and professional photographs, and I only learned about the chosen dress, with its $3,000 price tag, through a text message accompanied by a photo that read, "Isn't she beautiful? So excited," as if I were a distant relative rather than the father of the groom. The rehearsal dinner planning was perhaps the clearest example of my diminishing role. Robert offered to host it at his country club. The guest list was drawn up without my input, And when I asked about including some of Marcus's childhood friends and their families, people who had been part of our lives for years, I was told the venue had limited capacity, yet somehow there was room for Robert's business associates and Sarah's new social circle, people who had known Marcus for less time than I'd known his elementary school teachers. 3 weeks before the wedding, Rebecca handed me a beautifully printed seating chart with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We finally got the table arrangements figured out," she said. "It was so complicated with all the different family dynamics." I looked at the chart with growing horror. Table 1, closest to the head table, was reserved for Robert's family. Table 2 housed Sarah's relatives who had suddenly reappeared after years of absence. Table 3 included Rebecca's extended family. And there, at table 7 in the back corner of the reception hall, was my name alongside a collection of family friends I barely recognized. Meanwhile, the head table featured the wedding party, Marcus and Rebecca, Sarah and Robert, the man who would be sitting in the place of honor traditionally reserved for the father of the groom. I stared at that seating chart for a long moment, trying to process the magnitude of this insult. I was paying for this entire celebration, had sacrificed my financial security and peace of mind to give Marcus his dream wedding, and I was being seated like a distant cousin at the back of the room. When I brought this to Marcus's attention, his response was even more devastating than the seating arrangement itself. "Dad, we had to think about the social dynamics," he explained with the patient tone you'd use with a difficult child. "Robert knows a lot of these people through business, and Sarah has her family to consider. Besides, you'll be more comfortable with the people at your table. They're more your speed." More my speed. As if the man who'd raised him, sacrificed everything for his success, and financed his wedding celebration, was somehow not sophisticated enough to sit with the real family. The casual dismissal in his voice, the assumption that I would simply accept this relegation to the cheap seats, showed me exactly where I stood in my son's priorities. When I pressed the issue, suggesting that perhaps the father of the groom who was paying for the wedding might deserve a seat closer to the action, Sarah intervened. "Oh, don't be difficult," she said with that practiced smile. "It's just seating. The important thing is that we're all here to celebrate Marcus and Rebecca. Just seating. Just the symbolic representation of my place in my son's life, displayed for everyone to see." I realized that fighting this battle would only create more drama and potentially embarrass Marcus on his wedding day. So I smiled, nodded, and accepted my assigned place at the back of the room, even as something inside me died a little more. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect day that would make for beautiful photographs and lasting memories. I dressed carefully in my best suit, not expensive but well-tailored and appropriate for the occasion. As I drove to the venue, I tried to push down the growing sense of dread and focus on the positive. My son was getting married, starting his adult life with a woman he loved, surrounded by people who cared about him. Surely, when the day was over, the joy of the celebration would outweigh the months of financial stress and social slights. The church was already bustling with activity when I arrived. The wedding party was in high spirits, the flowers were stunning, and the photographer was capturing every moment with professional precision. I tried to find my place in the pre-ceremony activities, but it quickly became clear that I was peripheral to the main action. Robert was consulting with the wedding coordinator about timing. Sarah was orchestrating family photos, and I was standing around like a well-dressed guest rather than the father of the groom. The processional was the most painful part of the ceremony. I watched from my pew as Robert walked Sarah down the aisle, arm in arm, both of them glowing with pride and happiness. she was introduced as the mother of the groom, receiving the honor and recognition that came with that title, while I sat alone, unnamed and unacknowledged. When Marcus entered with his groomsmen, his eyes found Robert first, sharing a meaningful nod and smile that spoke of deep connection and mutual respect. Only then did he look my way, offering a brief wave that felt more polite than heartfelt. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Marcus and Rebecca exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising love, partnership, and mutual support through whatever challenges life might bring. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was listening to my son promise unconditional support to his wife while he'd spent the last 6 months systematically diminishing my role in his life. But watching him at that altar, seeing the genuine joy on his face and the love in his eyes as he looked at Rebecca, I felt a surge of the old parental pride that had sustained me through 22 years of single parenthood. This was what all the sacrifice had been for, this moment of his happiness and the beginning of his own family. The reception started well enough. The venue was spectacular. The food was everything the expensive caterer had promised, and the guests were having a wonderful time. I sat at my back corner table, making polite conversation with people I barely knew, watching the celebration I'd financed unfold like a movie I wasn't quite part of. The professional photographer moved through the crowd, capturing candid moments. The band played music that kept the dance floor full, and Marcus and Rebecca looked radiantly happy as they moved from table to table, greeting their guests and accepting congratulations. I kept waiting for my moment, the traditional father-son dance, a special acknowledgement during the toasts, something that would publicly recognize my role not just as a guest, but as the man who'd raised the groom. That moment never came. Instead, Robert was invited to share a dance with Sarah, introduced as the couple who had provided guidance and support during Marcus's transition to adulthood. I watched from my distant table as they moved gracefully across the dance floor, receiving the kind of recognition and appreciation I'd earned through 2 decades of sacrifice. Then came the speeches. Rebecca's father gave a touching toast about gaining a son and welcoming Marcus into their family. The maid of honor shared funny stories about Rebecca's dating disasters before she found true love. The best man regaled the crowd with tales of Marcus's college adventures and his devotion to Rebecca. And then Marcus took the microphone. He stood there in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking handsome and confident and every inch the successful young man I'd raised him to be. He began by thanking Rebecca's family for welcoming him and for raising such an incredible woman. He thanked his college friends for their support and friendship. He thanked the wedding party for making the day special. Then his voice grew emotional as he turned toward Sarah and Robert's table. "I need to thank my mom," he said, his voice catching slightly, "for coming back into my life and showing me what it means to have a complete family." The crowd murmured approvingly at this touching moment of reconciliation, but he wasn't finished. "And I especially need to thank my real father, Robert, for teaching me what it means to be a man, for showing me how to succeed in business and in life, and for being the role model I always needed." The room erupted in applause, guests dabbing at their eyes at this beautiful tribute to family and mentorship. And there I sat, 22 years of single parenthood erased in a single sentence, reduced to invisible irrelevance, while a man who'd known my son for 2 years received credit for raising him. Time seemed to freeze as those words echoed through the reception hall. My real father, Robert. The applause continued around me, but I couldn't hear it anymore over the rushing sound in my ears, like blood flowing or water breaking through a dam. I looked around the room at all these people celebrating what they'd just witnessed, the touching tribute of a son to his father figure, completely unaware that they'd just watched a man's heart break in real time. 22 years of 3 a.m. fevers, homework sessions, soccer games, camping trips, driving lessons, college preparations, and unconditional love had just been erased, as if they'd never happened. I wasn't his real father. According to my son, in front of 200 witnesses, I was nothing more than a placeholder, a biological accident, a temporary guardian who'd held the position until the real father could arrive and claim his rightful place. I felt something fundamental shift inside me, like a load-bearing wall collapsing. All the hurt, all the financial stress, all the months of being marginalized and disrespected crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. I looked at my son, still glowing with emotion as guests congratulated him on his beautiful speech, and I realized that I didn't recognize the person he'd become. This wasn't the boy I'd raised, the young man who'd once told me I was his hero, the son who'd promised that no matter how successful he became, he'd never forget where he came from. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and calm. The people at my table looked at me curiously, perhaps thinking I was going to add my own toast or congratulations. Instead, I straightened my jacket, placed my napkin on the table, and began walking toward the exit. I didn't rush, didn't storm out dramatically, didn't create a scene that would disrupt the celebration. I simply walked, my footsteps steady and purposeful across the marble floor of the reception hall. As I passed tables of guests still buzzing with excitement from Marcus's speech, some people nodded politely, assuming I was stepping out for air or a phone call. The hotel doorman held the exit open for me with professional courtesy, probably thinking I was a guest taking a smoke break or heading to my car for something. But I kept walking past the valet stand, past the ornate gardens where the wedding photos had been taken, past the life I'd spent $70,000 to celebrate, and I didn't look back. My phone started ringing before I even reached my car. Marcus's name flashed on the screen, then Rebecca's, then numbers I didn't recognize but assumed were wedding guests, calling on their behalf. I let them all go to voicemail and drove home in silence, my mind strangely calm despite the magnitude of what had just happened. By the time I walked through my front door, my phone had logged 17 missed calls and dozens of text messages. I poured myself a glass of the good whiskey I'd been saving for a special occasion. It seemed fitting that this qualified, and finally listened to the messages. Marcus's first voicemail was confused and slightly annoyed. "Dad, where did you go? People are asking about you, and we still have the cake cutting and more dancing. Call me back right away." The subsequent messages grew increasingly frantic and accusatory. "Dad, this is ridiculous. You're embarrassing me in front of Rebecca's family. Get back here now. What is wrong with you? This is my wedding day, and you're acting like a child. Sarah is trying to cover for you, telling people you felt sick, but everyone knows something's wrong." The text messages were even worse, a mixture of anger, confusion, and what seemed like genuine bewilderment that I would dare leave their special day. Sarah had sent several messages that managed to be both condescending and manipulative. "This is so unlike you to be dramatic. Marcus is devastated that you left during his moment of happiness. Please come back and let's discuss whatever's bothering you like adults." Robert, showing his true colors now that the pleasantries were over, was more direct. "Your behavior tonight was selfish and inappropriate. Marcus deserves better from the man who raised him." The man who raised him. Even in his criticism, Robert couldn't bring himself to call me Marcus's father. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so perfectly representative of everything that had led to this moment. I turned my phone off and sat in my quiet living room, surrounded by photos of Marcus from every stage of his life. First steps, first day of school, graduation, college acceptance letter. 22 years of memories that apparently meant nothing to him now that he'd found a more appealing father figure. I spent the next week in what I can only describe as strategic contemplation. While Marcus, Sarah, and Robert bombarded my voicemail with increasingly desperate and angry messages, I was thinking more clearly than I had in months. The hurt was still there, sharp and constant, but underneath it was something else. A cold, analytical understanding of exactly what had happened and what needed to happen next. If Marcus truly believed that Robert was his real father, then it was time to let him experience what that meant. Real fathers, after all, have real responsibilities. I made appointments with my lawyer and my financial advisor. I reviewed every contract, every receipt, every payment related to the wedding. I examined my legal obligations and discovered some interesting facts that would soon become very relevant to my son's new reality. You see, here's what Marcus never understood about the business world he was so eager to join through Robert's connections. Contracts matter, legal relationships matter, and when you publicly disown someone, there are consequences that go beyond hurt feelings. I had raised Marcus, loved him, and supported him for 22 years, but I had never legally adopted him. Sarah had never signed away her parental rights when she abandoned us. In the eyes of the law, I was not his father. I was a man who had voluntarily taken responsibility for a child who wasn't legally mine, and voluntary responsibilities can be revoked. The wedding vendors had contracts with me, not with Marcus. I was the guarantor, the responsible party, the one they would pursue if payments were disputed. Marcus had assumed that paying for the wedding was a simple gift, a one-time transaction that ended when the reception was over. But wedding contracts are complex things, with clauses about damage deposits, final payments, and what happens when services need to be adjusted or disputed. I had options. More importantly, I realized that my hurt and anger weren't the only emotions I should be processing. Marcus wasn't just ungrateful, he was naive about how the adult world actually works. He'd been seduced by Robert's wealth and Sarah's convenient return, but he'd never had to face the real consequences of his choices. Maybe it was time for him to learn some hard lessons about loyalty, gratitude, and the difference between fair weather support and unconditional love. My lawyer, David Chen, had handled my modest legal needs for years: house purchase, will updates, and the occasional contract review for my freelance work. But when I explained the situation and what I wanted to explore, his demeanor shifted from casual consultation to intense professional interest. "This is quite a complex situation," he said, spreading the wedding contracts across his conference table. "You're right that your legal position is stronger than your son might realize. The most important revelation was about parental rights and responsibilities. Since I had never formally adopted Marcus and Sarah had never legally surrendered her parental rights, my 22 years of financial support had been voluntary rather than court-ordered. This meant that while I had chosen to act as his father, I had no legal obligation to continue doing so. More immediately relevant was my position regarding the wedding expenses. Every vendor contract was in my name. I was listed as the responsible party for all payments, damages, and disputes. Marcus's name appeared nowhere on these documents. He was simply listed as the groom in service descriptions. This gave me significant leverage that no one had considered. Here's what most people don't understand about wedding contracts, David explained, pointing to specific clauses. Many services aren't considered fully delivered until final payment is made and a satisfaction period has passed. Photography contracts, for instance, often include clauses about album delivery, digital file transfer, and usage rights that can be disputed if the client isn't satisfied with the final product. The photographer's contract was particularly interesting. She was required to deliver edited photos within 6 weeks, but payment for her services wasn't due until those photos were approved. If I, as the contracting party, found the photos unsatisfactory for any reason, I could request re-editing or, in extreme cases, refuse final payment while the matter was resolved. The catering contract had similar provisions about cleanup standards, equipment return, and damage assessment that wouldn't be finalized for several weeks. Even the venue rental had clauses about property damage and cleanup standards that extended beyond the wedding day itself. "What you're describing," David said with something approaching admiration, "is perfectly legal contract management. If you choose to exercise your rights as the contracting party to dispute services or request modifications, that's within your legal purview. The fact that it might create complications for Marcus is an unfortunate side effect of his decision to exclude you from the planning process. I also learned about my rights regarding gifts and financial support. The money I'd spent on Marcus's education, living expenses, and other support over the years had been voluntary. But wedding expenses were different. They were payments for specific services that could potentially be recovered if those services weren't delivered to satisfaction. "There's one more thing," David said, his expression growing serious. "If you choose to pursue this course of action, you need to be prepared for the possibility that your relationship with Marcus may be permanently damaged. Are you certain this is what you want?" I thought about that question for a long time. Was I certain? Did I want to potentially destroy any chance of reconciliation with my son over a moment of hurtful words and poor judgment? Then I remembered sitting at that back table, watching Robert receive recognition for raising the child I'd sacrificed everything for, and I knew my answer. The next morning, I began making phone calls. Starting with the photographer, I expressed concerns about the rushed timeline for the reception photos and requested additional editing time to ensure the final product met my expectations as the contracting party. Since final payment wasn't due until delivery and approval, I was within my rights to delay payment pending satisfactory completion of services. The photographer was professional, but clearly frustrated. She had other weddings to edit and needed to maintain her schedule. But contract language was contract language, and I was simply exercising my rights as the client. The caterer received a call about potential damage to rental equipment that needed to be assessed before final payment could be released. I'd noticed some scratches on serving platters during cleanup that might require replacement or repair. Again, this was standard contract procedure, though it meant their final payment would be delayed while the assessment was completed. The florist learned that I wanted to review the cleanup standards for the ceremony site, as I'd noticed some plant material and decorations left behind that might violate our agreement about site restoration. Each of these conversations was perfectly reasonable and legally sound. I wasn't refusing to pay or breaking any agreements. I was simply being a thorough client who wanted to ensure all services were completed to contractual standards before releasing final payments. The vendors were annoyed but professional. They'd dealt with demanding clients before. What they didn't realize was that these delays would create a cascading problem for Marcus and Rebecca, who were expecting to receive their wedding photos, final catering receipts for their records, and other documentation needed for thank you notes and insurance claims. 3 days later, my phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time since the wedding, I answered, "Dad, what the hell is going on?" His voice was tight with anger and confusion. "Rebecca is getting calls from wedding vendors saying there are problems with payments and delivery schedules. The photographer says she can't release our photos until you approve them, but she can't reach you." This is insane. "I'm simply ensuring that all services were performed to the standards specified in the contracts," I replied calmly. "As the contracting party, it's my responsibility to verify satisfactory completion before releasing final payments." "Contracting party? Dad, these are our wedding vendors. We need those photos for thank you cards. We need the final receipts for our records. You can't hold our wedding hostage because you got your feelings hurt." Got my feelings hurt. 22 years of devotion reduced to hurt feelings, as if I was a petulant child having a tantrum rather than a man who'd been publicly disowned by the son he'd raised and supported. A week after my strategic vendor delays began, I wasn't surprised to see Sarah's car pull into my driveway, followed by Robert's luxury sedan and Marcus's Honda. They'd come as a united front, the real family arriving to deal with the problematic outsider who was disrupting their happiness. I watched them through my front window as they organized themselves. Sarah checking her appearance in the side mirror, Robert straightening his expensive tie, Marcus looking angry and determined. They approached my door like a delegation on official business, which in many ways they were. When I opened the door, their expressions ranged from Sarah's practiced concern to Robert's barely concealed irritation to Marcus's outright hostility. "We need to talk," Marcus said without preamble, pushing past me into my living room. The others followed, Sarah offering a tight smile and Robert nodding curtly. They arranged themselves in my modest furniture like a tribunal, with Marcus taking the lead as prosecutor. "This has gone on long enough," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to command attention in boardrooms. "Whatever game you're playing with the wedding vendors needs to stop immediately. You're embarrassing, Rebecca. You're causing problems for businesses that provided excellent service, and you're acting like—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Like a vindictive child." There it was again, the casual dismissal of my feelings, the reduction of my hurt to childish behavior that needed to be corrected by the adults in the room. I sat in my own armchair and looked at the three of them, noting how they'd positioned themselves. Sarah leaning forward with false concern. Robert sitting back with the confidence of a man used to controlling situations, and Marcus standing like a prosecutor delivering an opening statement. "I'm not playing any games," I said quietly. "I'm simply exercising my rights under the contracts I signed and paid for. If you have a problem with how I'm managing my business relationships, perhaps you should have considered that before publicly declaring that I'm not your real father." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah immediately went into damage control mode, her voice taking on the soothing tone of a professional mediator. "Oh, honey, Marcus didn't mean anything by that speech. He was emotional, it was a big day, and he just wanted to acknowledge Robert's influence in his life. It wasn't meant to diminish your role at all. Wasn't it?" I looked directly at Marcus. "So, when you thanked your real father Robert in front of 200 people, you weren't making a distinction between him and me? When you seated me at a back table while Robert sat at the head table, that wasn't a statement about our respective importance? When you made every wedding decision based on Robert's advice while ignoring mine, that wasn't about whose opinions matter." Marcus's face flushed, as the reality of his actions was laid out so clearly. Robert, apparently deciding that diplomacy wasn't working, leaned forward with the kind of aggressive confidence that had probably served him well in business negotiations. "Look," he said, his voice carrying just enough edge to remind everyone who had the real power in this room. "We understand you're upset about the seating arrangements and some planning decisions, but you're taking this way too far. These vendors are small businesses that depend on timely payments. You're hurting innocent people because of a family disagreement." "Innocent people," I repeated, almost smiling at the irony. "Like the photographer who's holding Marcus's wedding photos hostage until I approve them? Like the caterer who can't release final receipts until equipment damage is assessed? These are standard contractual procedures, Robert. I'm surprised someone with your business experience doesn't understand that." The temperature in the room shifted as Robert realized I wasn't going to be intimidated by his corporate authority. Sarah tried a different approach, her voice taking on the wounded tone of a mother whose child was being unreasonably difficult. "This isn't like you," she said, reaching out as if to touch my arm. "You've always been so reasonable, so focused on Marcus's happiness. Why are you choosing to hurt him now, when he's just starting his married life?" "I'm not choosing to hurt anyone," I replied, gently moving away from her attempted touch. "I'm simply letting Marcus experience what it means to have Robert as his real father. Real fathers handle real responsibilities. Since I'm apparently not his real father, these aren't my real responsibilities anymore." Marcus exploded. "This is ridiculous. You raised me, okay? Of course you're important to me. But Robert has been a mentor, a guide into the business world, someone who's helped me understand how to succeed as an adult. Why can't you understand that I can appreciate both of you without it being a competition?" "Because it became a competition the moment you made it one," I said, my voice still calm despite the emotional storm in the room. "The moment you started dismissing my advice in favor of Robert's, the moment you seated me in the back while he sat at the head table, the moment you thanked your real father while I sat there having spent $70,000 I didn't have to give you the wedding of your dreams. The number hung there like a revelation." I could see Robert calculating, realizing perhaps for the first time exactly how much this celebration had cost me. Sarah's eyes widened with what might have been genuine surprise, but Marcus just looked angry. "I never asked you to spend that much. I told you we could keep it reasonable." "You asked me to pay for your dream wedding?" I corrected. "Every upgrade, every premium option, every expensive choice that you and Rebecca made because Dad will handle it. And I did handle it, because I thought I was your father, but apparently I was wrong." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the gears turning in each of their minds as they processed what I'd said and began to understand the true scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or family drama. This was about accountability, consequences, and the real cost of taking someone's love for granted. Sarah was the first to break, her composed facade cracking as the financial reality hit her. $70,000? She whispered. "Marcus, you said the wedding was expensive, but I had no idea." Robert's expression had shifted from irritation to something approaching respect, the look of one businessman recognizing another's strategic thinking. He was beginning to understand that I wasn't just an emotional father throwing a tantrum. I was someone who had played a much longer game than any of them had realized. But it was Marcus's reaction that mattered most. The anger was draining from his face, replaced by something that looked like the first stirrings of genuine understanding. For the first time since Robert had entered his life, he seemed to be seeing the situation clearly. "The vendors," he said slowly. "They're coming after me for the payments you're disputing." "That's how contracts work," I confirmed. When the responsible party disputes services, the beneficiary becomes liable for resolution. It's basic business law, something your real father can probably explain to you. Marcus sank into my couch, his head in his hands. The photographer wants another $3,000 for expedited editing. The caterer is threatening to send the equipment dispute to collections. Rebecca's parents are asking questions I can't answer. And now you understand, I said, not without sympathy, what it means to be the one responsible for handling these problems. This is what Robert signed up for when you declared him your real father, the real responsibilities that come with the title. For the next hour, we talked, really talked, for the first time in months. Marcus admitted that he'd been seduced by the lifestyle Robert could offer, the doors he could open, the future he could provide. He confessed that he'd been embarrassed by our modest circumstances, ashamed of the small house and used car and careful budgeting that had been our reality for 22 years. "But I never meant to hurt you," he said, tears finally coming. "I never meant to make you feel like you didn't matter. You're the one who raised me, who was there for everything that mattered. Robert. Robert is impressive, and he's been generous with advice and connections, but he's not you." It was Sarah who suggested the solution, perhaps motivated by guilt over her own role in creating this situation. "Robert and I will cover the disputed vendor payments," she said. "It's only fair, since Marcus considers Robert his real father now. Real fathers handle real responsibilities." Robert, to his credit, nodded agreement, though I could see him calculating the cost of his new paternal status. In the end, we reached an understanding. Marcus would learn to navigate his adult responsibilities with guidance from his chosen father figure, while I would step back from the financial obligations I'd carried for 22 years. The wedding vendors would be paid, the photos would be released, and everyone would get what they said they wanted. But something fundamental had changed in our relationship. Marcus had learned that words have consequences, that taking someone's love for granted comes with a price, and that the people who love you unconditionally are rare and precious. I had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is allowing someone to experience the consequences of their choices, even when it breaks your heart to watch. 6 months later, Marcus called to tell me that he and Rebecca were expecting their first child. "I want you to be involved," he said. "I want my child to know their grandfather, their real grandfather, and learn about the kind of love and sacrifice that actually matters." Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.